for everyone watching, and obviously for our panelists, welcome to the Planning Futures Breakfast seminar entitled Remote Control, Keeping the Planning Process on Track. I'm Hannah David and I'm one of the directors of Planning Futures. And the format for the session this morning is that I'm going to give a brief introduction and then I will introduce each of our panelists who will speak for 5 to 7 minutes. We'll then move over to a Q&A. And please, if you're watching, do send your questions in at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. No hand raising, please. The questions will be taken from the Q&As that are sent in, from the questions that are sent in. Can I also mention that this session is being recorded and will be pushed out on YouTube and through other social media channels. So to begin, by way of introduction, obviously, COVID-19 has necessitated new approaches to the way that we conduct business. Some have been implemented more successfully than others. In the planning world, social distancing and remote working has meant that there's been a need for virtual planning committee meetings. There's been photographs and drones used in place of physical site visits, and changes to delegated powers allowing officers to make more decisions. Indeed, in one authority in Manchester, the constitution was amended so that the chief executive, together with the head of planning, could make decisions on major applications during the crisis. And in many cases, adapting to the crisis in this way has worked well. It has been encouraging to see how the public and private sector stakeholders have pulled together to keep the planning process and system moving. However, in many areas, the crisis has had a more negative effect. The Planning Inspectorate postponed public inquiries, hearings and examinations. With many council staff working from home, the administration of hard copy applications and correspondence has been very tricky to manage. And managing public access to committee meetings has been full of pitfalls, particularly for those without access to the internet. Today's event brings together an expert from local government, who's the head of planning at Redbridge, Brett Leahy, a planning consultant, Philip Smith from LUC, and the director and head of planning at Countryside, Andrew Taylor, so that we can explore what has worked and what hasn't worked during this crisis. There can be no doubt that the way we work will change dramatically from now onwards. The event today hopes to provide an insight and to impart some lessons learnt on how we can adapt most effectively to a post-COVID-19 planning environment. So to begin with, I want to introduce Brett Leahy. Brett is the head of planning and building control at the London Borough of Redbridge. He has 9 years experience in management and 19 years in the planning profession. He's worked for 5 local planning authorities, both rural and urban, during that time. Brett is a peer officer for the Planning Advisory Service and Local Government Association, where Brett has undertaken a number of reviews. He is also a member of the Society of Local Chief Executives, the RTPI and the Urban Design Group. So over to you, Brett.
Thank you, Hannah. Can I just confirm you can see my screen?
Yes, we can. Okay,
thank you. Now, welcome everyone. So yeah, I just got a very brief presentation where I just covered the experience at Redbridge. But before I go into detail, I think it's just quite important just to recap what we've been going through during the peak of the pandemic. I think the key thing is, as a planning service, we've sought to maintain a service, but also as a council, we've obviously had to respond to the pandemic and support our communities, businesses and residents. And almost we've become a COVID council during that time. And just to give you a quick sense of the level of transformation that's taken place within the council, which has impacted on the planning service, I just wanted to go through some key headliners. I think the first thing is that as a council, we had to develop a shielding wellbeing service for everyone over 70. So for example, there's 28,000 residents in Redbridge who are over 70, and we had to contact them once a week, every week, and deliver food parcels. So that's about 4,500 calls a day and food parcel deliveries by the council to support those residents and to provide that shielding service. We've also had to introduce track and trace to support the council and the government's initiative. And we've covered things like also mortality planning to avoid some of the scenes and some of the images we saw in America and in Spain and in Italy, given the fact that the death rate did double during the height of the pandemic. So as a council, we've had to take on quite a number of additional services to respond to this, and the planning service has had its role in terms of that. So for example, 50% of my policy team, enforcement, building control and technical teams were redeployed to facilitate those extra services that we are providing and continue to provide. In terms of development management, however, and in recognition of the government's need to ensure that we continue to determine plan applications, I did protect the development management service from redeployment. But I hope that sort of gives you a general context in terms of the transformation that generally took place within the council to respond and to support businesses and residents. In terms of planning then, I think, you know, picking up Hannah's point, it's been very much a virtual world. So in the case of Redbridge, we continue to determine over 100 applications a week. So we're getting and have been getting, even during the height of the pandemic, about 100 applications per week, and we're determining over 100 applications per week. Now we did that in terms of working virtually. Overall, 2,000 staff were working from home who work for the council. That's a big feat by the IT service. And that included obviously the planning teams. And so in terms of validation, in terms of decision making, that's all been done remotely. So in terms of service delivery, we've been able to maintain our service and determine that level of applications per week. We've also got teams, the power of teams, and I know everyone's very familiar with teams. We've been having meetings with developers, internal meetings, team meetings, all via Teams. Also at Redbridge, we do member briefings. So member briefings is to involve members in the evolution and provide comments in terms of schemes, particularly through our pre-app and PPA process. We've been holding those throughout the pandemic to enable councillors to engage in the pre-app dialogue and PPA process in helping shape schemes, but also helping applicants understand some of those political dynamics. And again, that's all been done virtually. We do have a design review process, and we're in partnership with a company called Frame, and we've been conducting virtual design review panels during this time. So the planning process itself has been continuing without any delay or any issues in terms of actually determining, assessing and issuing decision notices. Now, thankfully, I'm quite blessed with a good scheme of delegation. I can't claim to have created that scheme of delegation, that was my predecessor. But the benefit of scheme of delegation is that very few applications actually go to committee, and if they do go to committee, they're more the strategic ones. So I've only had to do one planning committee actually, but we have done that. And so basically the whole service has been operating remotely and virtually. Now, in terms of some of the operational aspects of the process of determining plan applications, consultation, site notices, you know, that has required people coming into the office. But what we've done is we've sort of dedicated certain members of staff, i.e. in terms of site notices, we've dedicated one member of staff who has a car to do that for us, to go out and place those site notices so we can still meet our statutory requirements. So it's not all completely remote, but where we had to come in, we've sort of put things and contingencies in place to ensure we can do that, but we do that safely. In terms of the policy work, we still continue to do that. Despite half my team needing to be redeployed to support the COVID response, to protect our businesses and communities, we've still been doing our policy work like our housing delivery test action plan. So that's sort of been ongoing. We've just had more time to actually get that work done. Now, interestingly, in terms of enforcement work, I did redeploy half my enforcement team, thinking unwisely that actually with everyone being at home, there wouldn't be much unlawful activity when it came to enforcement. I was mistaken. greatly. The enforcement activity doubled. And so the impact on the enforcement team and the phone calls from councillors and residents raising enforcement issues has been quite incredible. And that has proven a challenge in a sense of trying to undertake site investigations during the height of the pandemic. But we've had to do that virtually, using technology to enable us to come to a view in terms of whether or not certain things constitute and require enforcement intervention. But certainly the enforcement work and the level of activity that took place whilst people were at home was quite incredible, and we're still trying to deal with a backlog currently. I think one of the key things I do want to share is that whilst I like to believe in terms of Redbridge and other councils, we've responded incredibly well. Of course, I'm slightly biased, but I do believe we have, whereby we've maintained service delivery. I think one of the things that's been quite notable from my experience in talking to my senior management team, as well as my own managers, is the welfare and wellbeing staff. I think that the pandemic itself and then having to change the way you work has had an impact on people. Some people it's positive, some people it's negative, but some people it's both. And I think it's varying impacts. So those members of staff that have families, the juggling of trying to maintain child support, childcare, whilst also working full time has been incredibly challenging. And then I've got other members of staff, particularly the more junior members of staff that probably live in HMOs, who've become incredibly isolated during this time, as they're just in one room, stuck at this screen, basically not interacting with people. So there's been a real awareness organisationally and in terms of the management core, in terms of the impact on staff to ensure that the wellbeing and welfare is catered for, because there has been pressures, it has been stressful, and so support is needed. And I think the key thing from my perspective, and this is across the board, be it public or private, is just knowing when to switch off. When you work from home, you just look at the screen, 7 till 7, team after meeting, not knowing when to switch off. So some of the things we have been doing is obviously doing team lunches, quizzes and check-ins, and just the importance of seeing people visually on the screen has been truly recognised. And the key thing, I suppose, also is that working remotely and also experiencing the COVID experience and the impact that has on society and how nature and people's appreciation of nature has come into the fold. I think there's been a lot of reflections in terms of how we've been living, how we've been working, and what that may look like for future. I would like to say that obviously the way we've responded has shown resilience and versatility, and certainly, and it's something that we've discussed as a senior management team, we won't be going back to the way we worked before. And actually some of the things we've been doing will be taken forward because we can see the benefits with virtual working and the new ways of working. I think it's also highlighted the importance of social interaction. And I know that in terms of the council itself, we're not only trying to cope with the COVID response currently, we are preparing for the second wave, but also we're preparing for the economic recovery, because the council will be quite critical in terms of that. And with the planning service, we're looking how we can redefine our service to support that recovery, because that recovery piece will be incredibly important as we move forward. But also, I think, and it's been a real appreciation generally, I would say, a better understanding that whatever that recovery looks like, it needs to consider more closely and more considerably the social environmental principles that sit behind that. That's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brett. Oh yeah, I was going to say, are you able to turn off the screen? You've obviously raised quite a lot of issues, which we'll pick up on the Q&A, particularly interested in your comments about redefining the planning service that you're offering to support whatever new world we end up in post this crisis. If we could just move on to Philip next, please. Philip Smith has 30 years experience as a chartered town planner and currently leads NUC's 60-strong planning team. He has particular experience of social infrastructure, waste, health, biodiversity, forestry, open space and green infrastructure sectors, as well as contributing to the formulation and review of national, regional and local planning policy. Philip has led on major planning applications and EIAs. He has provided planning training and mentoring and is a member of the Essex Quality Review Panel. Over to you, Philip.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Good morning, everyone. I'll just share my screen, hopefully be able to see the presentation. Can you see that?
Yes.
Super. Okay. Great. Just to give you an overview of what I'd like to talk about in the next 5 to 6 minutes. Quick introduction to LUC. And then I was going to touch on where did we start from, you know, in mid-March. Where were we then? A few months ago, a hell of a lot's happened, but it's quite interesting to reflect on, you know, where we started from. We'll talk about a few things that are going well, both for LUC, but also, I think, for the planning profession generally. And then, of course, things that are not so well and some of the challenges, both looking at the internal and external challenges that we're facing. And Hannah, I've taken the liberty of saying a few things about what I'd like to see happen next as well. So a little bit about LUC. You can see the geography of our offices there. You can see the list of services. I'm going to talk really through the lens of strategic planning and assessment, which is really what I do, and it actually touches on work. We do a lot of work with local authorities, so a lot of work that, a lot of what Brett has said kind of resonates with me. There will be perhaps some repetition, but I think good to get a different angle on it. You'll see we've got an ecology team. I'm sure Boris Johnson will be pleased to hear that we actually had to furlough some of our newt counters, but he can be assured that they'll be back with a vengeance very shortly, which is...
Philip, can I, sorry to interrupt you, do you want to move from, we can only see screen 1 at the moment.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
Is that working now?
Yeah, so now we're on screen 2.
Ah, right. Apologies. That's, so you're on...
Now we've got a blank one, which is 3.
Ah, right. You're on overview, are you?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. I've just been through that. Now I'm on LUC. Sorry, you can see.
Yes, we're on LUC now. We're with you.
Super. Yeah, sorry. It's changing slightly different.
No problem.
Yeah, so sorry. Just been through that really, geography, etc. You can also see some of the awards. We were very pleased to win the RTPI Consultancy of the Year Award last year. So where do we start from? Where were we in mid-March? I think lots of uncertainty we'd all recognise as planners. Brexit delays the planning white paper, the environment bill, household projections. I was reading just yesterday that it looks like there are going to be some further revisions to household projections. So some fairly fundamental things in the system which bring uncertainty, and of course a backlog of delivery in housing as well, where, you know, that's before we went into the COVID season, as it were. So sub-regional planning, which is very close to our hearts. We've been involved in a number of sub-regional plans in the west of England, North Essex, South Essex, and significant challenges really in delivering sub-regional plans, even though there is evidence around their effectiveness in actually delivering housing. So then along came COVID. But what's going well? I mean, like Brett, I mean, really huge, massive support from the LUC team. We actually did a staff survey, quite extensive questions really, and I was amazed how positive the team have remained. Clearly well-being has been a bit of a challenge for many people, and I recognise the isolation points, but generally the team has adapted incredibly well, and we're very grateful to that. And in a way, it's a new, I've heard people talk, it's a new kind of social contract as well as an employment contract that I think employers have. Particularly pertinent for LUC, I should have said earlier on, because we actually became an employee ownership trust as from the 1st of January this year. After 55 years as a limited company, we're now an employee ownership trust. So we're very conscious, and we have trustees who hold the management to account. And as managers of LUC, we meet weekly to review a number of things, particularly obviously our financial position, with our priority being to protect our staff. IT has worked remarkably well for us, and I think more generally it seems to work well. The teams, the Zooms, virtual site visits we've used, yes, for our development management projects, but also for our greenbelt assessment, landscape work, some biodiversity stuff, but not much. Obviously, you need to be on the ground really for that. but it's been remarkably good. What's been brilliant for us is the online consultation hub that we've developed. And there's an example there from the Wirral, which we're doing a number of projects for the Wirral to do with local planning, basically environmental capacity studies. This is actually a green infrastructure study, which people can go into. There's a sort of virtual workshop session within there that you can join at your leisure, put on yellow stickies and so on, and it's incredibly effective. In fact, we feel with this, the success of online consultation, it's almost like being a victim of success with so many consultees sort of being forwarded documents to comment on, but that's a nice problem to have. Time for innovation. Interestingly, I feel very fortunate here, and certainly in my role, I'm obviously in the consultancy field, one constantly needs to innovate. We are doing that. The sort of things we're looking at is integrated evidence bases, making them more effective and cost effective for our clients. And, you know, for example, combining biodiversity net gain, green infrastructure and nature recovery and climate change, you know, putting it into one piece, really kind of looking at how that can be done. So quite a lot of innovation. In terms of externally, what's going well, I think it's true to say that it's a good time for the planning profession. It's good that we're in the headlines in a way, whatever they are, whether it's West Ferry or certainly the COVID. I think there's been references to things that planners do, which I think in my mind is very good to raise the profile of planners. And equally, I think it's a great time as a member for the profession. The RTPI is in great shape. We've got a new chief planner, which is also exciting and something good that's happened during this time. The challenges, yes, the internal challenges, certainly, as I say, recognise what Brett said, and we've had many internal challenges with staff and so on, although not insurmountable. The external challenge, I feel, for us planners, particularly strategic planners, is the uncertainties actually are amplified. There's a whole, high streets were already question marks around where we're going with high streets. That's pretty fundamental stuff if you're doing local planning or indeed sustainability appraisal. What is the role and function of high streets? How's that going to change as a result of COVID? Where is it going anyway? What's happening to the office market? All these things. The escape to the country, you've probably read about that. Quite disturbing, I felt, in a way. We spent a lot of time trying to focus development in urban areas. And what we're hearing now is that people wanting to leave urban areas to live in the country. So whether that will happen or not, it's certainly a challenge for us as planners, I think. So what we're actually seeing is some delays to project programs, including local plan timetables. I think that's partly because of staffing. It's partly because of that last point. Actually, plans do need to be suitable. The evidence needs to be right and up to date and relevant. And the world has changed massively. And so I think we're having some very interesting conversations with clients about the relevance of, the open space assessments that we're doing, the green infrastructure assessments. Are we looking at through the right lens? And it's good to pause, reflect, think about the future to get it right. Finally, what would I like to see happen next? Well, the first point, yes, obviously positive planning reforms with more resources for planning. Dream on, you might say, but absolutely it's necessary. I think capturing this renewed sense of community would be great. I mean, it's definitely there, it's evident. It's online as well as in, more online than in person. But it's really important, it's very relevant to planning. And I think if we can kind of capture that sense of ownership of planning and sharing the vision for communities, I think that'll be very, very good. And as Brett said, this identification with the natural environment, the natural world creeping back into our towns and people really engaging with it is very, very positive. And it sits very well with some of the major changes in planning that we should expect to see through the Environment Bill in terms of biodiversity net gain and so on. I'd like to see more support for regional planning. Clearly, duty to cooperate is not adequate. That final quote there is actually from Victoria Hill's letter to the Minister. Let's plan the world we need and build back better for the benefit of all. I thought it was an excellent statement, really. And obviously, for the benefit of all. That's what planners are really all about, which I think I'll leave it there, Hannah.
Thank you very much. Again, there's several issues that you raise, one of which seems to come up in most of the discussions we had, well, two of them actually. One talking about high streets and what's going to happen with our high streets, and the second are about resources. I think that that's going to come up as a big issue moving forward in the way that councils operate, as if it wasn't big enough before. But I definitely think that that's something that we can sort of draw out a little bit more through the questions, but that's something that's definitely going to come up. If we could just move over to Andrew. Andrew Taylor is the Director, Head of Planning at Countryside Properties, and leads the company's strategic planning function. Countryside focuses on delivering landscape-led urban extensions and new settlements, as well as urban regeneration schemes. Before joining Countryside, Andrew spent over 18 years in planning authorities in the southeast of England. He has experience of both urban and rural planning from small-scale exception needs housing to master planning new settlements, major town centre redevelopments, and international airport expansion. Andrew chaired the Royal Town Planning Institute Board of Trustees for 4 years to December 2016 and took on the role of the Honourable Treasurer in January 2017. He continues to be a trustee and on the RTPI's General Assembly. Andrew chairs the Leeds Beckett University Partnership Board and is also chair of the National Planning Forum's Management Committee, championing planning and inspiring all those involved in the planning process and in delivering a new planning agenda. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks so much, Hannah. And I haven't done a presentation, which is most unlike me, really. So
your T-shirt at the back there and sort of
exactly
everything you're about to say.
Yeah. So I'm going to just talk and try and fit in between what Brett and Philip have said. So Countryside, just to start that off, across England as a national house builder. And we've had quite an interesting few months, really. Quite interesting for me, certainly. I haven't been on the private sector side with any previous, recessions or seismic changes. So quite a change for me, certainly, in terms of seeing things from a different perspective. The first issues, obviously, that we had in terms of the planning side was getting sites back up and running again after we started to unfurlough staff and bring them back. And we're now back on all the sites we were on previously. We've started a few new ones, but there are significant challenges. All the social distancing that's been required on site means that we only have capacity for 60–70% of staff and output. So that will obviously have a significant impact in terms of what we can deliver, leaving aside the 2–3 months or so when we weren't really delivering anything. We've had lots of discussions with councils about the as operation. That's before the government brought out their changes. And it's quite interesting in the range of responses from councils, either a very quick, 2-day turnaround, either from the enforcement team or the planning officer, confirming that it's okay in writing or email, to, well, I'm still waiting for some responses from councils when we requested that in the middle of April. So, some councils really stepping up and some councils not responding at all, which is, I suppose, not unexpected, and probably the councils, I could have predicted the councils that wouldn't reply and the councils that would. And that's about ethos. Brett was talking about senior management and leadership, but that's the ethos from the councils. Similarly, we've had lots of conversations about Section 106 payments. I know certainly in relation to being on various calls across with Essex Developers Group and Kent Developers Group, talking to them, talking about the way that we not reduce the payments, but rephase them. So not only they will actually be pushed back slightly because the triggers will have moved because of housing completions, but actually slipping back to allow sites to get back up and running when otherwise they might not have done if the contributions were going to be a stop. But I think there's more flexibility that's probably going to be required going forward. Brett touched on design. We're already having sort of anecdotal comments. I mean, Redbridge results last week saying that they're sort of pulling out of London and focusing on areas where they can have large gardens and more open space. That's presumably as a response to customer demand. And we're also getting, comments from customers about the importance of space in the house to have working or private phone calls and things like that. And therefore, there's going to be a need for flexibility from councils in terms of changing housing designs and housing types, internal layouts, and trying to respond to some of those changes and demands. But that's all a relatively short-term implication, hopefully. I'd like to focus more on the medium and longer term and what we need in terms of making sure the planning system is going to be fit to deliver the communities we need. There's been a lot recently, Philip touched on this briefly in terms of strategic planning and the problem or issues or lack of success with many councils are having in terms of certainly cross-border or larger scale strategic planning. I'd probably go so far as to say that the current local plan system is not going to deliver those large scale schemes. And they are too complicated and the viability assessments and requirements around local plans are just not going to deliver that. So if we are serious about having well-planned, well-located new communities, we're probably going to have to think of a different way of doing that. And the government is obviously chucking out all sorts of ideas to see what sticks at the moment, whether that's through development consent orders or zoning or local development orders or a whole range of different ideas. Probably all have merit, all have disadvantages, but collectively we've got to try and work out what's the best way of doing that while keeping local input and local engagement. And Philip talked about public consultation. We've started a consultation on a master plan for 1,300 homes on a scheme, so jointly with the council, and engaging members of the public through, yes, hard copy brochures to everybody, but also the online engagement is more tricky. But at the moment, there's far more people coming to our online engagement than we've had coming to a drafty town hall in various evenings or weekends, and possibly, and we'll wait to see, but a broader range of society, not just those that perhaps have more time and don't have childcare responsibilities or whatever. People are sitting at home, people are at home, people have the ability to fill in a form whenever they want to, rather than go at those certain times. So there might be something to gain and grab hold of that moving forward. But also thinking about the issue of that local accountability for decisions. When I was in local government, I continually wanted to push up my delegation levels, and Brett touched on that in terms of the ability to carry out or continue making decisions rather than stop them. Virtual committees do seem to be working, and again, they do seem to I don't think politicians are necessarily voting en bloc, or they're not following a herd mentality quite so much, because they are sitting in the comfort of their own homes and they can't look at their neighbour and see what they're thinking, and no one's bearing, shouting at them just behind. So it's interesting. There are some different flavours of decision making coming forward. I'm sure they're going to want to get back to actual committees in an actual room at some point, but how can we capture some of those positive things? But with many of the zoning or local development orders or development corporations, development consent orders, they're quite nationally imposed, a lot of these. And while that might be important, certainly for core areas like Oxford, Cambridge, Arc, for example, you might need something nationally to pull those sorts of things together. I think it is important that each area has a local flavour and a local characteristic, and we have that local accountability to some of these things. And how we do that is going to be important to ensure that the public don't feel isolated from lots of these decisions. We heard in the last budgets that the proposal for development corporations in the Milton, Oxford, Cambridge Arc, and about how they come forward is going to be quite key. So I think there's a whole raft of opportunities coming forward in terms of planning. I don't want to be too negative. There are problems with the current planning system. There are delays. There are issues with it. Certainly, we've talked about funding. It's good to see, I think, a reference to the potential to overhaul planning fees moving forward. From a developer's perspective, I'm happy to pay to have a good quality planning service. That's really important. I want certainty in that. But on the other hand, there's no point paying if we can't get the staff resources there as well. So thinking about the training, thinking about the pipeline of planners coming through is equally important to me as a developer as it is to a local authority trying to find the staff. So I'm very optimistic about the future. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next 20 odd days in July, whenever we get the policy paper, and be able to start looking at the direction of travel from government. But there are a lot of positive things at the moment, and we need to try and grab them and direct the way rather than just be negative in all our responses. Thanks.
Thank you. Again, you've raised several issues. If I may, I just want to pick up on one of the themes that seems to have come out from each of you in some way or another. You've all mentioned resources and the way that authorities and decisions are made moving forward. Do you think, and I think this is a question for each of you actually, do you think there's an argument for permanently dealing with aspects of the planning process remotely now? So for example, remote pre-app meetings, planning committees often, you know, we're seeing from local authorities being done differently, but it is working in a lot of cases. And the interesting points you all make about public engagement as well, and consultation. Philip, very interested to hear a bit more about your online consultation hub. Which sounds very encouraging actually, and something that perhaps we can, you know, think should be moved forward more generally. I would like us to view this perhaps in a view of, you know, this resource issue with local authorities, because after all, the impacts of the crisis are going to and have increased the financial burden on local authorities. They were pushed before, but obviously are now going to be pushed even harder. So what aspects of the planning process should we seriously be thinking moving forward of implementing on a long-term basis? So perhaps we could start with Philip, actually.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I mean, I think quite a large part of forward planning or policy planning could go online. I mean, as Andrew said, what I think we'll see is a much wider diversity of people responding than traditionally we have. I think there's been a problem inherent in the plan making system for a while. We've done, for example, looked at the consultation responses for local authorities and summarised them, and it is actually quite scary how unrepresentative well, for a start, the percentage of people who respond in any given area, but of that percentage, how unrepresentative they actually are, which is a real problem, and because so much weight is attached to that in the decision-making process. So I think this has been a great experiment in going out to a wider audience, using new tools, making it more accessible, trying to attract people slightly differently through different techniques. I mean, our consultation hub is a very good discipline because what it does is it's a storyboard approach. So we're doing something at the moment, for example, from Winchester City Council, where it's a storyboard about their approach to climate change response and green infrastructure and greening generally. It's going to be a series of images online rather than a big report. There is a report, some evidence behind it. The key messages are there. The key findings of the work we're doing are there. And it's then facilitating people to respond in an informed way rather than going through some great big document. So I think there's two things there. There's who you're getting to, but also the discipline of online gives you more options in terms of how you present material. It forces you to be much briefer, I think, and targeted, and using storyboards rather than huge documents. So I do think a large part of policy planning consultation could go online.
Thank you. And Brett, from an officer's perspective, what would, in your view, help departments run more efficiently but still give that service that they should be giving in this arena?
Yeah, if I can just pick up on the points that have been raised by Philip and Andrew as well, I think that, and to go back to your core question, I think there's a resource issue. There remains a resource issue, and I think moving forward there will continue to be a resource issue for local plan authorities. And I think, picking up your point actually, Hannah, that will continue given the budgetary pressures in terms of responding to COVID-19 and the economic downturn. So that will remain an issue, and I think that needs to be tackled. I think digital technology has a place, and digital technology can assist and support. It's not the complete answer, but it's certainly part of the answer. So picking on the work that Andrew and Philip are doing in terms of that consultation piece, that's incredibly powerful. I did a peer review of Kensington Chelsea this time last year, and they did a digital consultation using social media platforms on like a development called Kensil. I was incredibly impressed by that, and the broad church of people they got to engage in that process was, yeah, remarkable and something to be replicated. It's good to see that that's being doing, and I think there's more we can do in terms of that. And certainly from my own authority, we're trying to embrace that type of engagement and using that technology, but doing that with developers due to that resource issue. We don't have the resources to do ourselves, but we do and can work with developers or applicants or investors to actually do that more meaningful engagement, because there is a place for that. In terms of moving forward, I know in terms of my council, we are looking to use technology more to ease that resource burden. I know, for example, I've been in dialogue with a planning advisory service to digitise the local plan, to use digital technology, and not for it to be a PDF type document, but to be a livable live document that's digital, that it's informed by data, so we can then come with more informed information to help inform our decisions. But going back to the point of planning committee as well, and even member briefings, I think that the technology piece, in my experience of what I've seen, it's picking up one of Andrew's points, the debate seems more informed, more considered, less political almost. Certainly in terms of the member briefings, where there's more scope for members to be more comfortable, and it's about creating that safe environment. Members, in terms of the interaction with the applicants and with officers, it's more informed and more considered more generally. It's almost helped raise the bar of the conversations and debate that members are having around proposals and what that means for the environment and residents, particularly given our greater awareness of the importance of nature, and for planning and development to do more in terms of responding to the climate emergency and supporting nature.
I think that comment you just made about raising the bar in relation to planning committees is actually very significant, is very important. Very interested to hear, actually, Andrew's your perspective on that. And also, Andrew, what would you like to see local authorities do more of remotely moving forward from your experience? So I suppose my question is, what have you seen work better remotely than it did face to face?
Well, I was going to pick on, I mean, I think you mentioned at the start pre-application discussions, and whether it's pre-application or just discussions with officers, it's actually been far easier getting a meeting in with officers over the last few months than it has been historically in some areas, because people haven't got perhaps the rigidity of various other things going on within the office, and there is a bit more flexibility. Certainly that's what we've found in terms of the availability of officers. Having said that, I've had meetings with people I've not met before, and that is far more difficult to have a proper discussion